Hi everyone. So I'm going to be doing my advocacy campaign plan on the issue of sex trafficking in New York State with a particular look at the Human Trafficking Intervention Court. So first as an agenda, I'm going to go over a couple definitions that I think are essential to understanding this topic and navigating it. The main social issue, which is sex trafficking, the policy approach issue, which are the Human Trafficking Intervention Courts, and then the proposed alternatives. So definitions. There are three definitions that I'd like to introduce before we go any further. The first is sex work and sex worker, which refers to an individual who consensually exchanges sexual services for money or goods, emphasis on consensually. And they define activities as income generating, if not their occupation. Opposed to that, there is a definition of sex trafficking or trafficking victim or survivor. This is an individual who engages in commercial sex acts due to force, fraud, or coercion, or they're under 18 years old. They're influenced or owned by a trafficker and have less agency, and they may even commit other crimes under the influence of a trafficker. In addition to that, there's a third term, prostitution. It is considered an outdated term or a slur for sex worker. It still refers to an individual who engages in sexual contact with another in return for a fee, but this is the terminology that is used in New York State's penal code. So going to the social and policy issues. Sex trafficking is considered a wicked problem. This is because it transcends many different systems and it has multiple entry points. So it's difficult to propose just one single approach that will eliminate this issue once and for all. What makes it really complicated is that it is fueled by a lot of assumptions, myths, and perceptions about sex workers, about sex traffickers and sex trafficking victims, and about prostitution. And all of these assumptions, myths, and perceptions kind of work together to create what I would consider an ineffective criminal justice response that tends to penalize rather than protect the victims. So the social issue component of sex trafficking, a little bit more detail about it. According to Polaris, which is the main organization behind the National Human Trafficking Hotline, there have been approximately close to 11,000 identified cases of human trafficking in the United States in 2018, the most recent year that data allows for. 78% of those human trafficking cases have been related to sex trafficking. Looking at that more specifically at New York State prevalence, there have been close to 500 identified cases of human trafficking. 86% of those have been identified as sex trafficking. What's important to know about this is that it is based off of the national hotline statistics, which means this is the number of cases identified through individuals calling the hotline. This in no way represents the full extent and the full prevalence of sex trafficking, of human trafficking more broadly in the United States, but it does provide us with a small snapshot. The unfortunate thing about these statistics is that in the United States, there is no federal data collection. There is no one single institution or organization that tracks human trafficking data and statistics, which makes it very hard to find single stats on. The assumptions and perceptions related to this span a whole host of issues. There's first this idea that sex work is considered immoral, that individuals who engage in sex work are criminal. There's this idea of rape myths and the overall idea that violence is a victim's fault. We see that when it comes to sexual assault, we see that when it comes to domestic violence, how could you not leave? How could you stay in this situation? How can you be coerced into doing something that you don't want to do? And these are exacerbated based off of gender and race. For example, when it comes to sexual assault, we know that young girls and women of color who experience sexual assault, a justification for having this issue happen to them is because they are more provocatively dressed or their bodies are more provocative and therefore invite or welcome sexual assault. This is another assumption that leads to sex trafficking. There's also the issue of the foreign or foreigner problem, which says that sex trafficking is an issue here. It's not a local issue. It's a global issue. It's happening somewhere else. Or if it is happening here, it's only happening to foreign-born individuals. And this is not the case. It also happens to United States citizens and is very much a local issue. So due to these assumptions and perceptions, past approaches have mostly consisted of arresting victims and charging them with prostitution. The approach has not been trauma-informed and mostly has perpetuated a cycle of trafficking by punishing victims, putting them into the criminal justice system, and putting them in a position in which they really cannot leave a trafficking situation or don't want to. But over time, at least in the past 10 to 15 years, changes in attitudes and approaches have happened. That we have seen an increased recognition of power and control dynamics that come into play when we talk about sex trafficking. We recognize co-occurring issues that individuals who are experiencing sexual abuse or human trafficking maybe also have drug abuse or alcohol abuse issues, maybe also have mental health issues. And we know now that those are vulnerabilities that make individuals more susceptible to becoming involved in sex trafficking. These changes in attitudes are to a degree reflected in changes in law in New York State from 2007 all the way up into a most recent act in 2018. We see this transition in the way that victims are viewed, going from more so treated as criminals to being recognized as the victims who have been in a situation that they've not put themselves into and they are not at fault for. So this shows us a nice timeline. I don't want to get too far into that, but I do want to highlight 2013, the Human Trafficking Intervention Courts, because that's what we're going to be focusing on. So the policy approach component, Human Trafficking Intervention Courts, what are these? So these were developed in 2013, originally as a pilot, and now have gone on to become 12 specialized courts. These are courts in which individuals who are charged with prostitution-related crimes, which in New York State is either defined as prostitution itself or loitering for prostitution, will have their cases looked at. So when an individual is arrested for prostitution, that case is deferred to a human trafficking intervention court. Defendants are evaluated by on-site staff. They're supposed to be connected to services, and they are expected to plead guilty to the charge. And by pleading guilty, they have the option of attending mandated sessions instead of going to jail. And if they complete these sessions and avoid rearrest for about 6 months, their convictions will be vacated. They're free to go. They can completely avoid jail. Sounds good, right? But not quite. So what's the issue with these human trafficking intervention courts? One, it conflates sex work with sex trafficking. The only reason that human trafficking victims are being picked up and connected to services is because they are being kind of captured or caught committing prostitution. Depending on who you're speaking to and depending on the philosophy fueling the argument, sex work and sex trafficking are distinct. And what this court does is force individuals who consensually engage in sex work, who have not been trafficked, into going through mandated sessions that they don't want or they don't need, just in order to avoid going to jail. In addition to that, it keeps the criminal justice system at the center. In order to connect to services, victims must go through law enforcement and the courts. This can be perceived as another form of punishment or re-victimization, considering that victims don't always have a positive experience in dealing with law enforcement, and law enforcement aren't often well trained to deal with trafficking victims. And this combination of the court and service provision really causes a distrust of services and even inadequate services. So not only are the services maybe not necessarily geared or adequate to really assist trafficking victims, but because a counselor has been referred to them by, a judge or police officer, victims are less likely to feel comfortable in that situation, working through their issues, working through their trauma, and leaving a trafficking situation. Lastly, there's no evidence of effectiveness. So these trafficking courts in New York City have been in effect since 2013, and yet there is no data collection on what happens to individuals who go through these courts, what the success rate is, how many rearrests have happened, if these individuals are free from sex trafficking, what's going on. Additionally, progress is measured by arrests and not personal goals. And lastly, what this does is really play into this idea of racial profiling. individuals who are brought into human trafficking intervention courts are disproportionately individuals of color, and they're also cisgender women. So what this does is present a racial profiling aspect, and it also shows that people, non-traditional individuals that you maybe people wouldn't immediately think are being trafficked, like men or transgender individuals or non-conforming gender or non-conforming folk, are very much falling through the gaps of the system. So it's not necessarily a best pipeline for getting trafficking victims to services. So what are the policy alternatives? One, protect, don't prosecute. And this can come in the form of reforming or removing the court completely. So the argument for this is that criminal justice response is necessary and can be reformed to reduce shortfalls and maximize effectiveness. How can this happen? We can train law enforcement to improve their screening and inclusion of individuals that maybe they wouldn't necessarily flag as potentially being victims. We can actually collect and track data to see if this is effective before making another policy decision. We can standardize the services. Like I had said before, individuals are expected to attend mandated sessions, but there's really no standardization or logic or I guess rhyme or reason to how these sessions are set up, how many they have to attend, if it works, if it's an arbitrary number. So far, there's none of that. They can make services available to anyone who wants them instead of just identifying or screening for trafficking survivors and then throwing out the rest of individuals who don't fit that. On the right-hand side, there's a list of stakeholders who would more or less be in support of this policy alternative. The second and the last policy alternative is to prevent, not perpetuate, and we can do that by decriminalizing sex work. So what is the rationale behind this? One, regulation could potentially equal protection. There are arguments that say that a legalized industry can regulate, audit, and track workers, making it so individuals are less likely to be trafficked. And when this industry is illegal and criminalized, as it currently is, stigma and fear prevents victims from seeking services and talking to service providers that could potentially lead to a proper screening for human trafficking and then lead them to services and help to get out of a trafficking situation. And so if we decriminalize sex work in general, then trafficking victims who are buried in the midst of sex work won't feel fear and stigma and angst about possibly being punished, and therefore won't feel like they can't talk to people and get themselves out of that situation. It stops the pipeline. So prostitution charges can make it difficult to get a job, especially after jail. So trafficking victims who have already been caught up in the criminal justice response and have already been sent to jail are much more likely to potentially go back into sex work and then be in a position of vulnerability in which they end up getting trafficked. So it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. There's also arguments that say that decriminalizing sex work decreases victimization. There's an argument that says that an increase in voluntary sex work supply, so more sex workers who are consensually providing sex in the commercial sex trade, would lead to a decrease in the demand for trafficking. And then this would also decrease violence against women or cisgender women and also gender nonconforming sex workers. And that is because, again, because the industry would be legalized and regulated and protected, individuals who are more vulnerable because they're more discriminated against are more likely to have protections and less likely to get into a situation of vulnerability that leads to trafficking. So overall, the argument for this is that the criminalization of sex work and the criminal justice response puts the onus on victims and perpetuates rather than prevents sex trafficking. And so in order to actually help sex trafficking victims, what we need to do is decriminalize sex work completely. On the right-hand side, again, are stakeholders that have already expressed or would express support for this, with the exception, I wanted to point out, of the governor at the very bottom. Actually, in this past year, in 2019, a bill to decriminalize sex work, I think, did make it to his desk. It was sponsored by a couple senators in New York State, and he had made a comment that, no, I'm not going to sign this. So the feasibility of this, we don't yet know. But on the same side, court advocates who are working in these human trafficking courts have found that this experience really just magnifies the fact that a human trafficking court is not the solution, but maybe decriminalizing sex work is actually the way to go.